study the photographs carefully. Look for tiny details. Appreciate the quality and the direction of light. Pretend that you are there on location. Feel the wind in your hair, the sun on your face, or the appropriate temperature. Imagine the sounds you would hear as you observe the scene. Let yourself become absorbed in the total experience which you and the photograph fashion together.
One of the biggest problems we have these days is that people are so far removed from first-hand experience with nature itself, with the outdoors, that they cannot make decisions that are really well-founded. In other words, a lot of people are enjoying the outdoors vicariously through television shows, movies, a walk in a city park, feeding pigeons in a concrete square in some downtown area. That's what they know of nature.
I regard myself as a naturalist photographer. I guess naturalist first, because I love animals and I love nature. And I just love this beautiful country that we live in.
Bob Taylor, I think, is a really great example of how you do not have to be a scientist or a trained, university-trained biologist to make significant contributions to our knowledge on Manitoba's natural species, biodiversity, and conservation.
Yeah, he had a very inquiring mind. He read a lot, but most of his knowledge was direct from being in the field. One of the best wildlife biologists I think I've ever met. He could see a bird from a great distance or hear its call or just the way it swooped, and he would be able to identify it. And so often we're driving along in the car, and he said, "Did you see that yellow warbler?" And I didn't even see a warbler.
He was just sort of a book of knowledge, and he always conveyed that to everybody. Anybody that showed any interest in nature or anything like that at all, he'd be more than willing to share any knowledge that he had. He was never a selfish person or a photographer that way. He loved to share what he knew with other people.
Bob was a modest sort of a guy. He wasn't the sort of guy that pushed in. Now, there are a lot of photographers I can remember the first time they met them because they were so rude. But Bob wasn't like that. And so I don't remember the first time I met him. I can remember many times when I met him out on the tundra, and I already knew who he was, and we got together because I had such respect for him in the way that he took people out there.
With a real expert like Bob, I think it's very good because he tells them what they should do and what they shouldn't do. The important thing, you might think that just walking where you will does nothing any harm, but a thing like a lichen, an old golden lichen, might be 50 years old. It seems too bad to just scuff it off. So he's very good at telling people how to, you might say, respect the environment.
You can walk around on the other rocks a little bit. Just try to be gentle. But the flat one's the one I'm most concerned about protecting here. When you look at these little things, a lot of people say, oh, you know, what's in that? It's just a little plant on a rock. But when you start looking intimately, it has the same fascination as an aerial photograph does, and in some ways the same fascination as flames in a campfire or water in a waterfall. After a while, it just keeps you looking at it and looking at it and looking at it. Oh, hang on a second. Here we've found a nice little patch of moss, and the first piece that I found is really quite interesting. But what I thought I would do is look around and see if I can maybe find a better composition or maybe a more interesting grouping of mushrooms. The point with this macro photography is not to just set up the camera in the first position that you kind of discover, but to explore around it and try and check other angles and so on. And then once you decide on a good angle for your composition, then start to get your equipment positioned so that you can take advantage of that angle. Well, I've just been editing the photographs that I took at Wager Bay. I got a few really nice shots of polar bears. I got some in the water swimming, but this sheet here is quite exciting because this is a bear coming out of the water, and rather than coming out and running away with his rear end towards us, this bear came up on a kind of a cliff, and he's walking sideways on the ledges. So the photographs are really nice because they're side views, and some of them show him stretching up, reaching up to the next ledge to climb up. And of course the water's running off him and dripping off him. So that's pretty exciting. We got some shots of another smaller bear here, and this bear was walking along a gravel shore, or a shore with big boulders on it. And we just backed off and waited in the boat until he came along further to a nice rocky area where there's a long sloping rock going down into the bay. And this guy he just puttered along and gave all kinds of nice poses. And at one point he laid down and looked at us and then got up and walked some more. There's a shot here where he's stepping across a crag or a kind of a little canyon about 1.5 feet wide. The rocks. So I'm quite pleased with some of the stuff that I've got on this trip. Whenever I look at a series of photographs like this, I keep thinking what a nice painting some of these shots would make. I guess one of the things I like to do most is actually do large paintings of wildlife or landscapes with wildlife in them. That requires that I spend a lot of time sitting in my little studio at the back and just concentrating on getting the painting accomplished. And it's a lot more exciting to be out running around the Northwest Territories or out in the forest somewhere. So over the years, I've had to really force myself when I wanted to sit down and actually get a painting accomplished. And the upshot of that is I haven't done as many paintings as I would love to do. Requires a lot of discipline to do that, and it requires a little less discipline to just jump in the van or jump on a plane and go somewhere and have a good time and have direct contact with the landscape and the wildlife.
We would go out constantly out in the bush, and I'd be with him when he was working on his great gray owl book, photographing great gray owls in the Sandilands region.
I went to Africa 6 times with Bob, and I also went to Churchill a few times. He introduced me to the wonders of Churchill. He managed to make people feel like they were really lucky to have him as a guide. And that's what I found out about him in Africa. The people there loved him. The people that ran the safaris from Africa just thought he was so special. They called him Bwana Bob.
He was so knowledgeable in birds and animals and plants and insects and butterflies and moths, you name it. And you knew if you went on a trip with Bob, you would get probably one of the best trips you're ever gonna have.
It was wonderful to get to know him and to meet him and the people that he knew and just be in that world. You know, I was in my world and he had his world, and then our worlds collided. So I think we were good for each other too. That's what everybody says.
He surrounded himself with people of passion, and that was a great gift that Bob would give you. He'd say, come on, you got to meet this guy, or you got to meet this guy. I'm going out to look for owls, and I'm going to have so-and-so in the car. And the conversation and the education you would get just by osmosis was a phenomenal gift.
I might have a hard time remembering the exact location and whatnot, but I certainly remember the banter between Bob Nero and Bob Taylor. I mean, two giants in their fields, and to be part of that and suddenly have these two individuals calling me friend and sharing so much information, knowledge, and passion with me for wildlife and for owls in particular, that I felt very privileged, and I was almost in awe.
I'd always been interested in owls since I was a kid. People on the next street over to us had a little screech owl in an old chicken coop, and I used to go almost every day and stare at that little owl, and he would stare back at me. I was fascinated by it. And then when I met Frank Smith, he was a bird bander, and he specialized in banding saw-whet owls. So I got involved in banding saw-whets and then screech owls eventually. But there was an elusive owl which I really wanted to see, and that was the largest of all, the great gray owl. One showed up in Toronto in the late 1940s, and Frank and a couple of other of his friends banded it, and they had talked about it a lot, so I was getting really revved up to find a great gray owl, and I never did until I came to Winnipeg in 1967. And then the following year, after I'd kind of put the word out a little bit, a woodcutter from the Pas, Manitoba called to tell me that he had found a great gray owl's nest, and I was welcome to come up and he would show me where it was. Well, it took me about 2 seconds to decide to drive to the Pas, which is 500 miles, and I jumped in the car and went up there, and sure enough, he had a nest of a great gray. I set up a tower to photograph it, and that just really got me interested in these particular birds. Then in 1970, we had a really nice great gray owl nest just down southeastern Manitoba. So I called Dalton Muir in Ottawa, and Dalton loaded up his trailer with the tower and everything, came out, and we spent a week or a little better than a week filming.
if he discovered a nest, like a boreal owl nest, for example, in our study area or near our study area, he would immediately share that knowledge with us. And in turn, when we discovered something that we thought he might be interested in photographing, we would share that with him. And I knew that by letting Bob know about these opportunities, that he would capture those images and spend amazing amounts of time, set up a nest site, for example, and the photographs that he would take would then in turn inspire people in ways that science, a scientific journal article could never hope to inspire the public.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing. Sometimes it's beautiful to be alone. You can be alone and not be lonely. Here I sit on my little tower at the boreal owl's nest and listening to the sounds of the night. To the north I can hear the spring peepers calling from Little Pond. Occasionally a gray tree frog calls. Way off to the south I can hear a whippoorwill. Intermittent, but very nice to hear. It is now beginning to get dark. The trees are beautifully silhouetted against the western sky, and the moon is shining brightly up behind me to the south. What a lovely night. It's calm, cool, but not cold. Some days it's just great to be alive. When the flash went off, I could see both his eyes. I think I got a real good shot there. Boy, did he go in fast, though. I didn't get him till he was leaving.
I remember the one day we were there, it was a great year for great gray owls that year. I think we saw 35 owls that day. We set up a little box with a mouse in a little Tupperware box with a white bottom on it and got a couple mice at the pet shop. And then put the cover on, a clear cover, and set it out in front of us. And the owl came so close it sprayed snow on us and trying to catch us mouse. He got some awesome shots doing that. And then it was used by a lot of other photographers as well since then.
He used to just let mice go. He'd spot the owl way across the snowy field, and he'd put mice out on the snow. And the owl would come and take the mouse. But this became expensive. Taylor was a very frugal individual. And although he felt good about feeding mice, they cost money. So his next project was to get he made a little plastic box with a lid on it, and he would put the mouse in that, and you put that out in the field. He thought that was a pretty good idea, except the owl came swooping right across the farm field, legs up, grabbed that plastic box, and flew off with it. And Taylor says, I got it figured. We go back, and he's fooling around in the house, the apartment that we're in, and he comes out with this fake mouse. He had sewn together, he got some fake fur, and he had sewed a mouse. Body this long, little tail. He even had a bit of a head to it. And on the head, he had attached a leader that would go to the fishing rod.
Well, this, I think it came from Dr. Robert Nero. He was a biologist, and he was studying great gray owls. And then Herb Copeland used to work with the Museum of Man and Nature. They would lure them in. They were theoretically fishing for owls. When the owls are hungry, they're down here because the food source is scarce in their own region. And so you take a artificial lure, it looked like a mouse, and cast it out, and then you'd reel it in, and the guy with the net, Herb Copeland, usually stood beside him with the net, and as the owl came in, just before it got to the mouse, he would net it. And then they would band this owl and number it, and then they would let it go. And they did that with probably hundreds of owls over the years.
I would take the fishing rod. Taylor would be over there because I had to pull it in front of him, not straight out. So I would we had a little bit of weight in it because it was too late to start off with, so we would put a fishing weight in it. And I would throw this thing out about 60 feet out on the snow and slowly bring it back. You'd have to do it 1 or 2 times before the owl would really start to pay attention, and you'd go out and you'd start to bring it back, and the owl would start to come. And Taylor'd be on. Slower, slower, don't bring it so fast. Okay, now bring it faster, because he wanted it to get right into the frame where he was. And so he'd be bringing this back, bringing it back, and then all of a sudden he said, stop, wait. And sure enough, that owl would lay its wings out flat, bring its feet up ready to pounce on that mouse, and that was my time to flip the mouse out of the way so Taylor could get the picture. And we had so much fun with that. We would do it over and over again. It was great sport, catching owls. Again, Taylor teaching me about the wilderness.
Basically, I do my photography for my own enjoyment. And luckily, it's the kind of stuff that a lot of other people like. So I'm in a fortunate position in being able to market a lot of my work because there are people out there who like it.
Living out of a tent or an old cabin for a couple of weeks, and you run out of all your fresh food, and so that's why we look so rough in that picture. You know, it looks like a picture from the late 1800s there, but it was us in the 70s. That was the days when the museum had money to send a crew, like 5 or 6 people, and there was different specialties there, like a geologist and a botanist and a bird people. I was studying mammals, so it was wonderful. Every day we would go out and do our thing and then come back in and share the information. So you learned a lot that way. The reason we were going was to discover new things along the coast. And I had thought maybe the Arctic ground squirrel might enter Manitoba, and so that was the species that I was really looking for. As soon as the plane landed, we opened the door, and there's Arctic ground squirrels right there on the rocks calling to us. So Bob got some great pictures. It just seemed so easy. He just seemed to pose for us. So that was a great start to that trip. And he'd spend hours on his stomach trying to photograph these little nestlings and also wildflowers, because one of our colleagues was doing a book on the wildflowers of the Churchill region of Hudson Bay. But a lot of the flowers are little tiny things, so he's on his stomach all day long focusing in on these things. I'm from Argentina, but raised in southern Quebec, and I went to McGill University and University of Illinois. And my first job was in Winnipeg, so that's what brought me here at the Manitoba Museum. I was the curator of mammals and birds. Bob was the head of the audiovisual department. When I arrived, he had the reputation as being one of the best bird photographers and wildlife photographers in Canada already.
I've done my share of commercial photography. I've photographed a few weddings, although as few as possible. My real love is wildlife and nature. So I've constantly been working my way over so that I could just do nature photography, just the things that I really love to do. Very few people get to do that. Most people end up slaves to a job they don't like just to get enough money to live on. But what I did was I learned how to live on a lot less while I got established doing the thing I love to do. I'd seen so many people say that they were going to wait until they retire and do what they really love to do, and they never made it that far. Or when they did retire, they just couldn't manage it anyway. So I decided that the best thing to do is just do what really is close to your heart and make it work. Or at least try.
Taylor left his job to go and open up a photography studio that was selling photographic art, which is the latest thing at that point in time in Osborne Village. And he thought he had the balls to go out and quit his daytime job and go out and try this. Well, he tried it for about 9 months, and it just wasn't working. He was smart enough not to ruin it, his hard-working money, and he quit that and became a photographer. And from there, he'd had to decide how he was going to make a living. Because before that, he'd always worked for museums, being their audiovisual guy. Taylor says, I like Africa. So I'm going to go to Africa, see what it's like, And then he leads 30 trips now to Africa, and that would pay his way and make a little bit of money. I want to go see the Arctic. So why not lead bird tours up to Churchill in the summertime and polar bear tours in the wintertime? And then who wakes up one day and says, I'm going to write a book?
I'd been involved in a couple of other books, but just marginally. But in 1980, I had a chance to do a book completely on my own through another publisher. And when the book came out, they had neglected to put my name on the front cover. And the publisher told me that the designer thought it looked better without my name on it. Being the kind of independent and maybe bullheaded character I am, I decided 4 years ago that I was going to publish my own book, and I was going to do it my way and make sure my name was on it, make sure that I made all the vital decisions. So we went ahead with it, and I published in 1990 The Manitoba Landscape, a visual symphony. It was a pretty scary kind of a thing to do, and it was a big investment. It certainly was almost the value of my house. But I was pretty sure that it would work, and I knew there was a real need for that book. So what I did was went ahead and published it, and then I loaded my van with books, and I headed out across Manitoba to all the little summer festivals, and any place I thought I could sell a book, I went and banged on their door or sat behind a little table and sold books. The consequence of it is that now in 4 years we've sold more than 8,000 of the Manitoba Landscape. And 2 years ago, I took some of the proceeds of that book and published another book called The Edge of the Arctic, which is on Churchill, Manitoba. And that was a book that was kind of in me and had to be let out. I've been going to Churchill pretty well every year since 1968, and I had a lot of good photos from there and a great attachment to the place. And because it's such a special and fascinating place for a naturalist or a wildlife photographer, I just felt that I had to do this.
The first impression of Churchill is that it's sort of a gravelly, rocky area with not much there. But once you start exploring the area, you find out there are just beautiful textures and landforms, and a great variety of wildflowers. There's many species of birds, a lot of which are unique that we don't find in other areas. And the more you explore this Churchill area, the more you see in terms of design, texture, landform, so on. It's just a fascinating place, but you have to learn to see what's around. You have to explore it in depth. There's a new flower that, these are the first blooms I've seen. This is Dryas integrifolia is the Latin name, but it's called Arctic avens, A-V-E-N-S is the common name for it. Within a few days, the highlands are going to be coated with this stuff.
For 15 years, I ran photography workshops at Churchill in the summer in June. And then since the mid-1970s, I've participated in the polar bear tours at Churchill. My friend Al Chartier actually started polar bear tours there in 1975. He had a little tundra vehicle, a little tracked vehicle, and he wanted to go out and study bears and just see if we could get close to photograph them and so on. Of course, I was eager to go along with him and see what we could do.
And it took them a while to figure out how to actually approach a polar bear and get photographs of a polar bear. It wasn't like nowadays. Polar bears are quite habituated to those great big rovers and buggies and things. At that point, we used small track vehicles, and we were trying to get in tight and get on the same level of the bears so that you're not looking down at the bears and that sort of thing. And it was pretty tricky, and they were just determined, and they just kept it. It took a couple of years to figure out how to approach these bears.
Things have evolved a great deal. Initially, right at the very beginning, this is going back into the 70s, when the Churchill dump was in full swing, and people just wanted to come and see some bears, and they'd be happy to go and photograph them in the dump, which is about the worst place to go and see a bear as far as I'm concerned, whether it's a polar bear or a black bear. But people were very excited and very happy because that was one of the few places you could go to see a polar bear. Well, then as the tours started to grow a little bit, and then a fellow named Len Smith in particular developed the tundra buggies and started taking people out on the tundra. There were one or two trucks and small buses that did things like that, but they were pretty primitive. But then, so that was really the start of a really big swing, and people no longer wanted to look at bears in the dump. They wanted to look at them from the tundra and see them out by the coast and see them doing more of the things that bears do for a living.
Over the years, I've spent a lot of time with these bears, and I've learned that they're really very gentle, inquisitive, and fascinating creatures. A lot of people think that bears are savage man-eaters that are going to track down every human and chomp them up and so on, but really they're just a big carnivore that eats meat. And I'd say for the most part they would run away from a human. Now, you can't take a chance because they're so powerful and they're very fast. So you have to be careful working around them. But if you work from the safety of a small tundra vehicle or some other situation where you're not vulnerable to the bear and spend time watching them, you can see that they're really mostly curious and they're very playful at times. Sometimes you see them come together and wrestle or spar. And sometimes it seems like it's fairly serious fighting, but usually they don't injure each other and they just go away and mind their own business after it's over. And sometimes after wrestling for a while, they'll lay down and fall asleep, actually nudged up against each other. I've never really gotten tired of photographing polar bears, and especially when you see them interacting with each other, or especially if you find a sow with some cubs or so on. They've given me a lot of really amusing opportunities for photographs, and they've given me a lot of really magnificent opportunities to see them in amongst the broken chunks of ice or see them in a blizzard. Or one of my favorite photographs, polar bear in a fog. That was pretty mysterious and fascinating to me. So after pretty close to 20 years of photographing polar bears, I still can't wait to go and see the next one. And you never know what I'm going to come up with and what I'm going to see on the next venture.
Where you really see someone who has a feel for the area is when you go out on a tundra buggy, you've got 20, 30, 40 people there, and you don't see a bear. Because people go to see a bear. And then it's only the people that know enough about the environment and the other animals that are there that can make the day really interesting. And that's where someone like Bob came in, because he had this genuine interest in everything that was there, whether it was a plant or the water or the bears or other mammals or geese flying over.
Bob Taylor was a naturalist through and through. Like, some people are naturalists for a few weeks of the year or a few months of the year. That was Bob's life. What you see is what you got. You know, he was one of the first ecotourism type thinkers that we ever ran into.
The reality is, you know, when you do research as a biologist, there are limitations in terms of budgets, time, number of people involved. And so the incredible power of having an engaged citizenship, contributing information on biodiversity, on species, it's really important and necessary to get more extensive information and to collect information on a scope and scale through time that would be impossible for any agency to hope to gather. So I think what Bob Taylor did in the early years was what we refer to as a self-taught naturalist. And the power of a single observation, recorded or shared in an accurate manner, can be extremely revealing about the nature of species.
You find that most people who have a general interest in wildlife and the outdoors, and they gain so much more if you take the time to tell them a lot more about what's going on. And I think that was where one of Bob's really big strengths, and his personality was electric, and his dedication was phenomenal, and people just as like iron filings to a magnet. Bob would start talking and you could just see the people sitting up and listening and taking it in.
He cared so much about the whole aspect of nature. The only way he felt anything would ever be done is if he could convey his message of all the things that are going on in the world and so on, and about the way nature has gone and changed over the years, that convey that to other people, that would benefit nature in the end. That was his biggest concern. It wasn't necessarily about a polar bear or a whale or something like that. It was a whole big picture that he promoted.
Bob's interest wasn't just in bears or just in owls or whatever. He was interested in the overall ecology of the areas that he went to and all of the animals and how they interacted. And to me, that was not only one of his personal strengths, but it was something that I admired.
One of the things that's always been a great mystery to me is how people could think that we can use up the environment. We can dump our junk into the rivers and our waste into the rivers, and we can throw garbage overboard in the oceans and dump trash out of our automobiles as we drive along the road, and can just generally abuse the environment and the earth and still expect that it's going to provide a suitable environment for us to live in. Even when I was a kid, I would think, how could somebody put chemicals down the drain or in the toilet and just flush it away and think that it's just gone forever? I guess part of that awareness for me came from growing up in the East End of Toronto and in this beautiful Don Valley where we used to hike as kids. We were told, be careful of the water, it's polluted. Pollution was a strange concept to me in those days, but we soon began to see signs of it. And it's been really hurtful to me to see some of the things that have happened to our environment over the years.
Bob saw in his lifetime, when you would go to Delta Marsh, the ducks would come over you and they would literally block out the sun. And he saw that to when they just don't do it anymore. He was up in Churchill way before the tundra buggies, and he saw polar bear mothers having triplets. In his last years going up to Churchill, twins became an anomaly, and a lot of females didn't have any cubs. And Bob knew why. The environment, their environment, was shrinking. It was disappearing right in front of in his short lifetime. There was a huge difference in how much free land there was for the animals, the birds, etc.
I think that by showing people how to appreciate what's there, how to care for it, through my photography or through my lectures and so on, I think that I can kind of build a core of people who do really care and who can go out and the activists and can affect the politicians, can write letters and so on to help us see that we've got to look after what we've got.
In many ways, he was like a little boy that never grew up. He just loved wandering around the bush and fields and capturing things on film. He just had such a respect for all living creatures. And We often talked in today's environment where everyone has, these electronic toys, and it's very hard to interest children in the outdoors often. How today's children aren't getting the same kind of experience that Robert Taylor and I did, where we grew up in the natural environment and learned so much about it, and it was something that stayed with us the rest of our life. But we talked, how do you get young people today to respect life like that?
My mother was asking me what I wanted for Christmas, and so I said, gee, I don't know. And this happened, this little magazine or catalog came out, and there was this book called The Great Grey Owl, Phantom of the Northern Forest, by Bob Nero, with illustrations by by Bob Taylor. A lot of his photographs are in that book, as you know. So I said, why don't you get me this book? And so she did. I got it for Christmas, and that book was a real eye-opener for me, a revelation. It said, wow, there's this place called Manitoba, and look at all these amazing owls that they have here, these great gray owl. So it was a combination of Bob Nero's words and Robert Taylor's pictures that really sowed the seed for me moving to Manitoba in 1985 to come and study great gray owls. I guess all my decisions since then have been influenced by the owl, which in turn, was stimulated by the work that they did, and their ability to affect someone like me way off in Montreal.
Well, my interest in wildlife started very young. When I think partly maybe because my father was a hunter and fisherman, and his friends were always there talking about hunting and wildlife. And then there was a fellow who lived out behind us who had pigeons and rabbits, and I was always over at their place watching, looking at his pigeons and looking at the rabbits and so on. And we collected bugs and frogs and so on when we were kids, my brother and I.
That would drive my mother crazy, because she'd go downstairs one day and there'd be a snake sitting on the floor looking at her, and the next day she'd go down and there'd be 2 or 3 owls flying around in the basement. And she really didn't like birds that were flying around at her. And then, of course, Bob got involved there with Ted Warren, who lived across the street in Dawes Road. Jerry Anderson lived around on Coleman Avenue, which was the first street around from us. And they would go down into Dentonia Park and look for birds and animals and whatever they could find.
Well, that little pocket off Dawes Road was a dandy, and we could walk there just in 10 minutes. So that really became our second home.
The large wooded area where Bob, Ted Warren, and I would always prowl around. We caught the saw-whet owls, screech owls, long-eared owls, and so on. Kept them in an old coal room in the basement of our house.
We were a pretty energetic bunch at that time, boy. Anywhere we could go and see anything and get out of doors, we did.
Bob was always bringing things home. I can remember when we lived in Scarborough, he'd be bringing owls home, and he'd have them in cages in the backyard and that, so that he could observe them a little more. Mainly so they could study it further and take a look at it better. And eventually they started a bird museum in Ted's basement.
Well, and Bob made a big sign. They hung in front of the house, and it Trump Bird Museum, I think. And I can't remember whether we had anybody come through the place, but we were pretty proud of that.
And I think it was the fact that I had a strong interest in nature that kind of drew the attention of the people at the Royal Ontario Museum. You see, in those days, there were very few kids interested in outdoors or nature. And when they did spot one, they kind of helped to cultivate the interest and encouraged it. And while I was there, I met Bill Carrick. And Bill, in 1956, he was doing a film and he needed a helper. And he hired me to work with him making films. That really sparked my interest in photography, and my plans to become a biologist soon changed to become a photographer.
He had a room that was in the basement. It was his workshop, but he also had a lot of his collections in there. He built a cabinet, and when you open it up, one would be all bird skulls, and the next one would be something else that he'd collected, and he just sort of always bringing stuff home. He was just naturally curious about things, and he would always, you never know what to expect from him next.
I've always thought that the sort of things we got into and did as kids they stuck with us. Bob, wildlife photographer, and Jerry and I, we followed our own careers, but we've never let the nature go.
Curiosity is the key to knowledge. I was born with the need to explore, to discover what makes a thing work, to know what creatures live in a given place and how they function, and a need to see what is around the next bend. This has led me through a lifetime of fascinating experiences and revelations. Taylor's words. It was always an adventure with Taylor, always an adventure.